Okay, I'm going to focus very narrowly on the details here and what I'm hoping you can do yourselves by looking at the story and getting its subtext. You're going to have to look back at it, maybe even reread most of it, if not all of it, for especially for the second part. All right. So what I'm going to do is something I expect for you to do, demonstrating it. All right. So we're in the tea room with Esme and our narrator. Okay. So this is the part of the flashback or the letter he's writing to her groom, her husband. Um, and she, let me just back up a little bit. About the time their tea, and what we're going to look for, sorry, is how details reveal these things. Right? About the time their tea was brought, the choir member caught me staring over at her party. She stared back with those house counting eyes of hers, then abruptly gave me a small, qualified smile. Um, the house counting eyes are sort of a stare where she's just analytically taking in what's in the room. And a qualified smile is one that is, it's not just a smile, it's sort of like based on, it's almost not not committed to this, where like the smile's only going to sort of to see what she gets back from it, right? It's tentative. It was oddly radiant, as certain small qualified smiles sometimes are. I smiled back, much less radiantly, keeping my upper lip down over a coal black GI temporary filling showing between the two of my front teeth. The next thing I knew, the young lady was standing with with enviable poise beside my table. This is a significant element. She has been brought up in an upper class British um, household, and so poise is everything from posture to etiquette, right? Jumping into thank you, she said, perhaps just for a fraction of a second. This is when he invites her to drink to join him. We see here her sort of precocious, look it up, um, way of speaking. She tries to speak like an adult, and she tries to use big words. And the title of the story is derived from that. Right? I got up and drew a chair for her, the one opposite me, and she sat down on the forward quarter of it, keeping her spine easily and beautifully straight. Again, this poise is something I'm highlighting because this has to do with understanding the contrast of what I'm going to focus on. All right, so she has been brought up to sit up perfectly straight. That's something that you're trained to do in that type of British household. All right, yes, quite, my guest, said my guest in the clear, unmistakable voice of a small talk detester. She doesn't like talking about the weather, which is what he asked about, small talk. She placed her fingers flat on the table edge like someone at a seance, then almost instantly closed her hands. Her nails were bitten down to the quick. So she sits and puts her hands. A seance is when you all sit around the table and put your hands on the table and try to speak to the dead. But the thing here, her nails were bitten down to the quick. This is something that is a detail that breaks from the other elements of poise and etiquette and upbringing. She's been chewing her fingernails. And so she closes her hands because she realizes that she's showing that and she's embarrassed. She was wearing a wristwatch, a military looking one that looked rather like like a navigator's chronograph. Its face was much too large for her slender wrist. You were at choir practice, she said matter of factly. I saw you. Now, these two details juxtaposed back to back, her nails bitten down to the quick and then the wristwatch, are two things that are going to be paired throughout, and there's a reason for it. We know, you know, because you've read this, that she gets that watch from her father who has died. Um, Skipping down to just another sort of detail that reveals her character, her governess was now urgently signaling her to return to her own table, in effect, to stop bothering the man. My guest, however, calmly moved her chair an inch or two so that her back broke all possible further communication with the home table. Um, just her ignoring the governess. The governess is sort of like run down and has kind of given in, acquiesced to the children. Down here, she becomes insulting. You seem quite intelligent for an American, my guest mused. I told her that was a pretty snobbish thing to say if you thought about it at all, and that I hoped it was unworthy of her. In other words, he hopes this was just a slip from her poise and etiquette. She blushed, automatically conferring on me the social poise I'd been missing. In other words, she embarrassed herself, and suddenly he's the one with the poise. Well, most of the Americans I've seen act like animals. They're forever punching one another about and insulting everyone. And you know what one of them did? I shook my head. One of them threw an empty whiskey bottle through my aunt's window. Fortunately, the window was open, but does that sound very intelligent to you? It didn't especially, but I didn't say so. Now, I want to pause for a second here. You'll notice that what Esme says is in quotations. He has just been summarizing the things he says. We don't have any direct quotations from our narrator. Uh, the focus being on Esme, not him. He's more of a passive character. Again, this is the audience's, the man who's about to marry Esme 7 or 8 years later. I didn't especially, but I didn't say so. I said that many soldiers all over the world were a long way from home, that few of them had many real advantages in life. I said I thought that most people could figure that out for themselves. This is his first sort of that's sort of a takedown of her snobbiness, and he's showing empathy for the soldiers. Possibly, said my guest without conviction, so she's not buying it. She's not really buying into that. She raised her hand to her wet head again, picked up a few limp fragments of blonde hair, trying to cover her exposed ear rims. This is just her uh, worrying about how she looks. Um, Skipping down, are you married? She dives right into personal questions. This matches up with her. Now, remember, our narrator has not been talking to anybody. He has been alone. Remember, we pointed out that there are ping pong tables and he that are an axe length away, and he doesn't even go near them. He's antisocial. But these questions are not, and he starts with small talk, but she cuts right into it. Are you deeply in love with your wife, or am I being too personal? I said that when she was, I'd speak up. In other words, they're connecting because there is this honesty, and this is one of the things about children. Some people read this, you bring modern eyes to this and think this is a creepy situation. Um, but really it's just the precocious and honest and open nature of the kid, of all kids really, is what seems to appeal to him, right? She put her hands and wrists farther forward on the table, and I remember wanting to do something about that enormous faced wristwatch she was wearing, perhaps suggest that she try wearing it around her waist. Usually I'm not terribly gregarious. Look it up, she said, and looked over at me to see if I knew the meaning of the word. I didn't give her a sign, though, one way or the other. I purely came over because I thought you looked extremely lonely. You have an extremely sensitive face. Again, this is not the way most children speak in terms of the language and syntax, but it is still with that sort of guileless honesty of a child, where they just say what they're thinking. I said she was right, that I had been feeling lonely and that I was very glad she'd come over. So he returns the honesty. I'm training myself to be more compassionate. My aunt says I'm a terribly cold person, she said, and felt the top of her head again. I live with my aunt. She's an extremely kind person. Since the death of my mother, she's done everything within her power to make Charles and me feel adjusted. My mother was an extremely intelligent person, quite sensuous in many ways. She looked at me with a kind of fresh acuteness. Do you find me terribly cold? So she's just kind of skipping over the death of her mother as if just a fact, like she wants to be a jazz singer in Ohio. And then she follows up with, "Do you find me very, very cold?" Her detached approach could be, if we read this psychologically, because we know that both of her parents are dead, this might be part of her coping mechanism. She's not actually this unaffected by it. In fact, when Charles comes over, I'm going to skip these details for now. They're just kind of there for humor and to characterize him. Um, she kind of displaces the actual sadness about the death of her parents, and we get to see the relationship she had with her father over here. Esme nodded. Father adored him. She bit reflectively at the cuticle of her thumb. Again, this is socially unacceptable behavior. She can't seem to help it. This is repressed sadness that she's chewing at her fingernails, all right? And they're already worn down to the quick, like you said before. He looks very much like my mother, Charles. I mean, I look exactly like my father. She went on biting at her cuticle. My mother was quite a passionate woman. She was an extrovert. My father was an introvert. Look it up if you don't know that. Now, the father, being an introvert, someone who is not social, now you don't have to, who prefers to be alone, and notice that the only details here are about her chewing on her fingernails. Again, a breach of etiquette. But she can't help it when she talks about her father. The man that she's talking to, our narrator, is also sort of introverted. He has a very sensitive face and he looks lonely. They were quite well mated, though, in a superficial way. Well, that's kind of an insult. Just on the surface, they seem to be well mated. To be quite candid, to be honest, father really needed more of an intellectual companion than mother was. He was an extremely gifted genius. So now she's gone from complimenting her mother to critiquing her because her father is, in her eyes, more. intellectually deep. I waited receptively for further information, but none came. She changes the topic. I looked down at Charles, who was now resting the side of his face on his chair seat. When he saw that I was looking at him, he closed his eyes sleepily, angelically, and then stuck out his tongue, an appendage of startling length, and gave out what in my country would have been a glorious tribute to a myopic baseball umpire. Myopic means short-sighted, but you know that because you looked up the words. It fairly shook the tea room. What he's describing here is a raspberry. Oh, I can't do it. It's too early in the morning. You stick your tongue out and you make a raspberry sound. Okay. So Esme gave me a long, faintly clinical look. You have a dry sense of humor, don't you? She said wistfully. Wistfully is sort of like kind of looking at the nostalgically almost, or just thoughtfully, a little bit sad. Father said I have no sense of humor at all. He said I was unequipped to meet life because I have no sense of humor. Watching her, I lit a cigarette and said I didn't think a sense of humor was of any real use in a pinch or in a bad situation. Father said it was. This was a statement of faith, not a contradiction, and I quickly switched horses. In other words, he tried to make her feel better about not having a sense of humor, trying to be kind to her, and she says Father said it was an important thing. He said it wasn't. So he tries to be nice, but she says this as a statement of faith, something she believes to be true, not just trying to contradict him or argue. All right, he picks this up and he quickly switches topics. I nodded and said her father had probably taken the long view while I was taking the short view, whatever that meant. He didn't know how to get the foot out of his mouth, so to speak. All right, and again, this reveals something about her love for her father. So what I'm pointing to here is Esme has pain and suffering, and so does our narrator. And this is the point of connection for them. For the narrator, there's just something innocent and pure and open about her that he can connect to, and also the fact that she too is suffering, even though that's the thing she's not honest about. That is coming through by her chewing on her fingernails. Like I said, it's a breach of etiquette that doesn't match anything else about her. It's also a nervous condition, right? And we can see why Esme's interested in this conversation, because the man, our narrator, reminds her of her father, all right, who she misses, but she can't say that. Charles, of course, is just the goofy comic relief, but she describes him as the one that is the one suffering. So she's displacing. There's a psychological term for that I can't think of right now. She's projecting her sadness onto him. All right, so that's the end of this. I'm going to stop here.